Alright, let's get into it. Number 10. The Children on the Volcano. At 6,739 meters, the summit of Llullaillaco on the Argentina-Chile border, there is a shallow platform cut into the rock by hand. In March 1999, the archaeologist Johann Reinhard and his climbing partner Constanza Cerruti reached it after weeks of survey work and found 3 children, seated, wrapped in textile, arranged as if the mountain had simply closed over them and waited. They are known today as the Llullaillaco Maiden, the Boy, and the Lightning Girl, the last named for the burn damage a strike later left on her body. But before we uncover what happened to them, subscribe now, because the deeper we go, the more disturbing these ancient discoveries become. Radiocarbon and historical dating place them at around 500 years old, placed on the summit during the reign of the Inca state, sometime between 1450 and 1480 CE. What makes them impossible to look away from is not the altitude, it is the cold. At that elevation, temperatures rarely climb above freezing, humidity is negligible, and the body was sealed inside dry, oxygen-poor soil almost immediately. The result is not mummification in the Egyptian sense, resin and salt and deliberate desiccation. It is flash-frozen preservation that Egypt's climate could never produce. The maiden's internal organs are intact. Her lungs still hold their shape. Blood remains in the smaller vessels of her heart, dried to a dark lacquer but recognizably blood, under a microscope 500 years on. Andrew Wilson's team sequenced strands of hair from all 3 children in 2013 and read the last months of their lives out of the keratin. Coca and alcohol consumption rose sharply in roughly the final year, consistent with the Inca practice of capacocha, a rite in which children selected for their beauty or lineage were fed, feted, and walked for months toward the mountains, considered closest to the gods. The isotope curve does not read as cruelty administered all at once. It reads as a slow, ritualized preparation, followed by an ascent from which the children did not return. The boy's stomach still held a final meal. Whether that meal was eaten willingly or under sedation is not something tissue can answer. What the tissue can answer is that death at this altitude, in this cold, came quickly, likely from exposure and the mild sedation the coca supplied rather than violence. No cut marks, no trauma, just a slow drop in a small seated body until the heart stopped, and the mountain did the rest. The textiles are as informative as the tissue. The maiden was wrapped in a feathered headdress and a fine woven mantle, dyed with cochineal red, cloth of a quality that, based on comparable Inca textile studies, would have taken a skilled weaver the better part of a year to produce. For a garment meant to be worn once, and then buried forever at 6,700 meters, miniature figurines of gold, silver, and spondylus shell were arranged around each child. 1 figure per child, dressed in clothing that mirrors what the children themselves wore, a kind of doubled offering, the body and its small proxy sent up the mountain together. CT scanning carried out years after the discovery, without ever unwrapping the bodies, found that the maiden had likely died last of the 3, possibly hours or days after her companions, her heart rate and breathing slowed by the cold and the coca until they simply did not resume. Bacterial activity inside all 3 bodies is effectively zero. Freeze-thaw cycling at that altitude is minimal enough that ice crystals never grew large enough to tear the cell walls, the way freezing usually does to biological tissue, which is why the preservation reads as suspended rather than mummified. Pathologists who have examined the scans describe organs that look, on imaging, close to what a modern autopsy would show. They are held today at the Museum of High-Altitude Archaeology in Salta, Argentina, in refrigerated cases built to imitate the only climate that ever kept them whole. Take them out of the cold, and 5 centuries would start moving again within days. Number 9. The bog that would not let go. In the peninsula of Drenthe in the northern Netherlands, in May 1897, 2 men cutting peat for fuel struck something soft. What came up out of the black was a girl, roughly 16, lying on her side with a woolen band still knotted around her throat and a 2-meter braided leather cord wound beside her. She is known as Eyed Girl, after the village nearest the find. Radiocarbon work carried out much later, in the 1990s, dates her to somewhere between 54 BCE and 128 CE, the Iron Age transition into the Roman period for this part of Europe, a time with no written record of its own. Bog preservation runs on chemistry that has nothing to do with intention. Sphagnum moss, as it dies, releases sphagnum, a compound that binds nitrogen and starves the bacteria that would otherwise consume a body. The same acidic low-oxygen water that pickles the moss into peat pickles skin, hair, and stomach contents along with it, while dissolving bone almost entirely. The result is a person turned to leather, sometimes decades or centuries after the flesh of anyone buried in ordinary soil would be gone. White girl's hair, originally reddish blonde, survived shorn to stubble on one side, the kind of asymmetry sometimes read as ritual humiliation, and sometimes as simple damage from centuries in the peat. CT scanning carried out at a Dutch hospital in the 1990s found a curvature in her spine consistent with scoliosis, along with the wound path of a knife across her collarbone and the cord still doing what it had been tied to do. The acid that preserved her skin is the same acid that erased almost everything else useful to a coroner. Sphagnum demineralizes bone as it works, softening it until, in many bog finds, the skeleton is barely more than an outline pressed into the surrounding leather of the skin. Eyed girl's bones are so decalcified that for decades museum conservators handled her with the caution to something closer to wet paper than to a skeleton, and it was not until forensic facial reconstruction was attempted in the 1990s by the artist Richard Neve, using techniques originally developed for modern police work, that anyone produced an image of what she may have looked like alive, a reconstruction now displayed alongside the body itself in the Drenthe Museum. Isotope analysis of her remaining bone and hair, carried out well after the original excavation, found a diet consistent with the general population of the region rather than anything unusual, no sign of ritual feeding or deprivation in the manner later found in some of the Andean high-altitude burials. Whatever chose her from among people who otherwise ate what everyone around them ate. There is no trial record, no accuser, no name. There is a wool band, a body, and a species of moss that happened to be growing in the right place at the right acidity to stop time. The one thing the bog did not preserve is a reason. Number 8. The man they photographed like a crime scene, because it was one. In County Offaly, Ireland, in 2003, machine peat cutting exposed a torso first, then the rest. The find went to the National Museum of Ireland, where the archaeologist Eamon Kelly examined a man in his early 20s, muscular, with manicured nails and a diet, established later through isotope analysis, that was unusually rich in meat. The diet of someone of high status rather than a laborer, Old Krogan man, named for the townland where he surfaced, is dated to roughly 362 to 175 BCE. His hands are the detail that makes this entry different from an ordinary bog find. The whorls of his fingerprints are still legible enough that police forensic technicians, called in as a formality, could have run them through a modern database. The damage to the body is deliberate and specific. His nipples had been cut. In early Irish tradition, sucking a king's nipples was a gesture of submission, and mutilating them was, in Kelly's published interpretation, a way of ensuring a rejected or failed ruler could never again receive that submission from anyone. Hazel rods had been threaded through incisions in his upper arms, a restraint or a marker, the sources don't specify which. He had been stabbed under one arm, and the body was cut in half at the torso, the lower portion never recovered. His diet is what first flagged him as unusual before any of the mutilation was even assessed. Isotope analysis of his bone collagen, carried out at the National Museum's Conservation Lab, found a protein-heavy diet dominated by meat. A marked contrast to the cereal-heavy diet of most Iron Age Irish remains recovered from the same general period. Combined with his height, estimated from his surviving limb proportions at roughly 1.9 meters, well above the average for the period. The picture that emerges is a young man who ate like someone with the standing to demand it. Kelly's broader argument, developed across multiple published papers through the 2000s and 2010s, situates Old Krogan man and several comparable Irish bog finds along ancient tribal boundary lines, and beside routes associated in later medieval sources with kingship rituals and inauguration sites. Under this reading, bodies like his were not victims of common violence, but failed or rejected candidates for kingship, disposed of at the literal edge of the territory they would have ruled. Their mutilation matched point for point to specific humiliations recorded, centuries later, in early Irish law and literature. Other researchers remain more cautious, noting that the textual sources post-date the burial by well over 1,000 years, and that reading a specific mutilation as pointing to a specific insult risks working backward from the wound to the story rather than the other way around. What ties this entry to Eyed Girl and to the bog bodies still to come is the accident of geography. A belt of Iron Age northern Europe, from Ireland through Denmark into Germany, produced these deposits in numbers large enough that scholars now treat bog deposition of the dead, including the mutilated dead, as its own recognized category of practice, distinct from ordinary burial. The mechanism that kept old Krogan man's fingerprints readable after roughly 2,300 years is the same sphagnum chemistry that kept Eyed Girl's skin intact. The reason for what was done to either of them, biology cannot supply. Chemistry only preserves the question. Number 7. The face that still looks like sleep, Bjeldskovdal in Jutland, Denmark. May 1950. Two brothers cutting peat for the winter found a body curled on its side, so fresh-looking that they reported it to the police as a recent murder. The police could do nothing with it. What they had found had been in the ground for roughly 20,400 years. Tullen Man's face is the reason this entry belongs on any list about biology behaving like it shouldn't. The skin over his closed eyes, the stubble on his chin, the creases at the corner of his mouth, all of it survived essentially undistorted, so that photographs of his head look less like an archaeological specimen and more like a man who lay down and has not yet woken up. A leather cord was still cinched around his neck when he was found, the noose that killed him. His last meal survived too. Analysis of his gut contents identified a porridge of barley, flax, and knotgrass seeds, a mixture some researchers, based on later reconstruction and chemical analysis published decades after the find, have linked to a possible funerary or ritual meal rather than ordinary daily food, though this remains argued rather than settled. His hands and feet, by contrast, were among the few parts not preserved, having been removed for study soon after discovery, in an era before conservation techniques could keep an entire body intact for permanent display. Only the head and one foot survived today at the Silkeborg Museum, the rest replaced with a modeled reconstruction, PV. Glob, the archaeologist who published the definitive early account of Tullen Man in 1965, described the discovery as being met at the time with the same procedural instincts any modern police force would apply to a body found with a rope around its neck, before the radiocarbon results came back and rewrote the case from a homicide into an artifact. That whiplash, from active investigation to museum accession within days, is not unique to Tullen Man among Danish bog finds, but his is the case most often cited, because the face made the confusion so easy to understand. Photographs taken at the moment of excavation, before conservation altered the skin's color and texture, show a man who, but for the surrounding peat, could pass for someone found in a field the previous week, later redating using accelerator mass spectrometry. A more precise radiocarbon technique unavailable in Glob's era narrowed the original broad estimate to a window centered on roughly 375 to 210 BCE, placing him a century or more before Groball Man, rather than as a close contemporary, correcting an assumption that had held in the literature for decades. Danish archaeologists in the 20th century read Tullen Man and bodies like him as accident victims, criminals, or outcasts. The current, more cautious reading treats the deliberate placement, the careful arrangement of eyelids and limbs, and the recurring pattern of violent death by hanging or throat cutting across dozens of Iron Age Danish bogs as more consistent with sacrifice than punishment. What is not disputed is what sphagnum did to him. It stopped 2,400 years from touching a human face and left the rest of us the disquieting job of looking at it. Number 6. Two brothers, one grave, one death for one of them. Nydam and Graubahl, less than 20 kilometers apart in Jutland, produced two of the most studied bog bodies in the world. But it is Graubahl Man, found in 1952 by a peat cutter named Togbusk Sørensen, who carries the most extreme evidence of violence. Radiocarbon dating places him at roughly 290 BCE, making him a few generations older than Tullen Man and from a different part of the same bog culture. His throat had been cut ear to ear so deeply that the wound nearly reached his spine, a cut inconsistent with any accident and inconsistent with most forms of self-defense. His right shin also carries a fracture, and forensic examination has found evidence consistent with a blow that broke the bone shortly before death. In 1955, before conservation science had caught up with what had been found, Danish police fingerprinted him, treating a 2-0-plus-year-old man as though he might still be identifiable through channels that had not existed for the entire span of recorded human history. The prints came back unusable against any modern record, but they are on file, filed the way any body is filed, because the ridges on his fingers were, and still are, as sharp as the day he died. X-ray and CT analysis, carried out at Aarhus University in the 2000s, reconstructed his skeleton and dental wear, establishing an age at death in the early 30s and evidence of childhood malnutrition or illness recorded in his tooth enamel, the same kind of stress marker later found at other prehistoric sites entirely unconnected to Grauballe. Evidence that hardship early in life leaves a signature that outlives the person by thousands of years. Conservation nearly cost the discipline this level of detail entirely. In 1952, the standard treatment for a waterlogged organic find was to tan it, essentially converting the body into leather through the same process used on animal hides, a procedure the museum applied before the full implications were understood. The tanning process darkened his skin to the near black seen in most photographs and shrank the body somewhat from its original dimensions, meaning the Grauballe man on display today is, in a literal sense, a slightly different physical object than the one lifted out of the peat, preserved twice over, once by the bog and once, imperfectly, by the people who found him. Gut content analysis identified more than 60 species of plant seeds in his final meal, a porridge-like mixture dominated by grains and weeds, gathered rather than cultivated, alongside trace ergot, a fungus that grows on grain and, in sufficient quantity, produces hallucinogenic and toxic effects. Whether the ergot was incidental contamination or a deliberate component of a final ritual meal is argued rather than resolved. Another detail on this entry, like so many others, that biology preserved perfectly and meaning did not survive to explain. There is no trial for Grauballe man any more than there was for Tullen man or Eyed girl. There is a windpipe cut through in a single confident stroke, a peat bog with no motive to give up, and a body so well kept that scientists 100 lifetimes removed from his death could still count the years of famine written into his teeth. Number 5. The people who were buried 3 times, South Uist, in Scotland's Outer Hebrides, at a site called Cladd Hallan, is the only place in Britain where deliberate mummification of the dead has been confirmed archaeologically. Excavations led by Mike Parker Pearson through the 1990s and 2000s uncovered several bodies beneath the floors of Bronze Age roundhouses, and 2 of them, an adult male and an adult female, turned out on closer study to be something the excavators had not expected. Radiocarbon dating of different skeletal elements within the same individual returned wildly inconsistent ages, a red flag that eventually resolved into an unsettling picture. The male skeleton combines the torso of one man, dead around 1600 BCE, with the skull, jaw, and limbs of at least 2 other people, one of whom died centuries later, all assembled into a single articulated body and buried as one person around 1120 BCE. The female skeleton shows a comparable composite pattern. The preservation itself is what places this entry on the list. Chemical and microscopic analysis of the bone found evidence consistent with peat immersion shortly after death, the same acidic, low-oxygen chemistry that produces bog bodies, applied here deliberately and briefly, just long enough to halt decomposition and fix the tissue, before the bodies were removed, dried, and curated, likely wrapped and kept above ground, for what osteological wear patterns suggest may have been several hundred years before final burial. Terry Brown's team, working with Parker Pearson, confirmed the composite nature of the skeletons through ancient DNA analysis, published in 2012, extracting genetic material from different bones within what had been cataloged as single individuals, and finding mismatches too large to be explained by normal degradation or contamination. The male skeleton's skull and mandible do not share a genetic profile, meaning the head itself is assembled from at least 2 different men. This was not sloppy archaeology mistaking a jumbled grave for a single body. It was the opposite. A composite constructed by Bronze Age hands with enough anatomical skill that, More than 3,000 years later, it took a genetics lab to catch what a trained excavator's eye had not. The likeliest explanation, advanced by Parker Pearson and colleagues, is that mummification and curation served a social function beyond simple burial, allowing a household or lineage to keep a physical, tangible ancestor present, consulted, or displayed across generations, with individual identity becoming less important over time than the role the assembled body played. A single continuous ancestor stitched together, quite literally, from whichever remains were on hand when repair became necessary. Piecing together bodies from more than one person and keeping the composite recognizable and intact for centuries requires an understanding of preservation chemistry that nothing in the surviving material record explains. There are no written instructions, no depicted rituals, nothing but the bones themselves, assembled from people who in life may never have known one another, curated long enough that the community burying them in 1120 BCE may have had no idea the ancestor they were entering was already, by then, 3 different people wearing one skeleton. Number 4. The man frozen mid-argument with a mountain. September 1991, the Ötztal Alps, on the border between Austria and Italy. 2 hikers, Helmut and Erika Simon, found a body emerging from melting glacier ice at 3,210 meters. It was first assumed to be a modern mountaineering casualty. Radiocarbon dating quickly overturned that. Ötzi, as he became known, died approximately 5,300 years ago in the Copper Age, and the glacier that killed him is also, almost certainly, the only reason anything of him survived at all. He is the best documented human body in archaeology, not because more was done to him after death than to anyone else on this list, but because more has been done to study him since. CT scanning has mapped his skeleton in full. His stomach and intestines, still holding their final 2 meals, ibex meat, einkorn wheat, and traces of bracken fern, were analyzed layer by layer in a study led by Albert Zink and Frank Meixner, published in Current Biology in 2018. Reconstructing his last 33 hours with a level of resolution no other prehistoric death has matched. The cause of death took 10 years to establish. A 2001 CT scan found an arrowhead lodged in his left shoulder, still cutting into the subclavian artery. He bled out within minutes to hours of being shot, likely from behind, at some distance, by someone who then, based on the position of an unfinished arrow shaft found with the body, may have retrieved the weapon rather than leave evidence. His right hand carries a defensive wound, consistent with a knife fight in the day or so before death. He was not alone up there by accident. Something, or someone, had been chasing him. His skin carries 61 tattoos, simple parallel lines made by rubbing soot into cuts, clustered at joints, later shown by radiological study to have suffered degenerative damage, arthritis in the knees, the lower back, and a hip. The tattoos line up with acupuncture points still used in traditional medicine today, more than 2,000 years before acupuncture's earliest written record in China, a coincidence still debated rather than explained. His full genome was sequenced in 2012, published by a team led by Albert Zink and Karsten Pusch, and it did more than confirm his ancestry, tracing closely to modern populations of Sardinia and Corsica itself, a striking finding, suggesting the genetic makeup of Copper Age Alpine Europe has been largely displaced from the mainland since. The genome also flagged a predisposition to cardiovascular disease, and subsequent CT work identified calcified plaque in his arteries, hard evidence of atherosclerosis in a hunter widely assumed, before Ötzi, to have belonged to a population too physically active and too lean-fed for the condition to take hold. His gut also carried Helicobacter pylori, a bacterium linked to ulcers, of a strain closer to the modern South Asian lineage than the modern European one, a detail that has since been folded into broader arguments about the movement of populations, and their bacteria into Copper Age Europe. Even his equipment survived intact enough to reconstruct: a copper axe with a U-handle, a bow left unfinished, 14 arrows in a deerskin quiver, only 2 of them fletched and ready, and a woven grass cape. An unfinished bow, and mostly unfletched arrows in the hands of a man who died running from someone, is not a detail that requires interpretation. It is a man caught between preparing for a fight and being ready for one. He is kept today at -6 degrees Celsius and 98% humidity in a purpose-built cell at the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, a chamber engineered to replicate, as precisely as possible, the glacier that made him. The murder is unsolved. The murder weapon left the body. What stayed behind is the man, still holding the evidence the killer couldn't take with him. Number 3. The girl who never left the mountains she was tattooed for. In 1993, in a burial mound on the Ukok Plateau in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, near where Russia, China, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan meet, the archaeologist Natalia Polosmak opened a chamber sealed under a layer of permafrost ice that had never fully thawed since the Iron Age. Inside was a wooden coffin, 6 sacrificed horses in full harness, and a young woman, roughly 25, whose skin still carried its ink. She belonged to the Prehistoric culture, a nomadic Iron Age people, and radiocarbon places her burial at roughly 2,500 years old. What makes her body different from every other frozen find on this list is the mechanism. The tomb was constructed with a timber chamber under a stone cairn and meltwater from summer thaw seeping down through the mound and refreezing each winter built up a solid block of ice around the coffin, effectively converting a Siberian burial mound into a natural freezer that ran continuously for 2,500 years. Her left arm and shoulder carry elaborate tattoos of griffins and stylized deer with antlers curling into flowers, applied with a technique that used soot mixed with an unidentified binder, pricked into the skin with a sharp implement and still crisp enough under modern imaging that the artist's individual line work can be studied stroke by stroke. Embalming had also been used, and CT scanning found that her brain and some organs had been removed and replaced with grass and other material, consistent with mummification practices Prehistoric burials elsewhere in the Altai have also shown, meaning she was both mummified and separately preserved by ice. 2 overlapping systems, each capable of keeping her intact on their own. Doc-style analysis of her burial clothing, carried out over the years following excavation, identified a silk blouse, a rare and clearly imported material for a nomadic community this far into the Siberian interior, alongside a felt headdress reconstructed at nearly 90 centimeters tall, requiring an internal wooden frame to stand upright, decorated with gilded wooden animal figures. The reconstruction of that headdress alone, undertaken by Russian conservators piecing together collapsed and fragile felt, took years. An object that had to be preserved with nearly the same delicacy as the body it was buried beside. Isotope and pathology work, published in the 2010s by Polosmak's collaborators, found evidence in her bone tissue consistent with breast cancer, along with signs of an earlier traumatic injury, possibly from a fall, that would have caused chronic pain in the years before death. A woman living with a terminal illness in an Iron Age nomadic society, buried with 6 horses and elaborate imported textile, complicates any simple reading of her status as purely ceremonial or purely medical. It may well have been both, a healer who had become, by the end, someone in need of healing herself. She has become known in Russia as the Ukok Princess or the Siberian Ice Maiden, though nothing in the burial itself indicates royal status. The horses and grave goods suggest instead a woman of some ritual or social importance within her community, possibly a healer or storyteller. A reading proposed by Polosmak, based on comparative Prehistoric burial patterns rather than direct evidence. Indigenous Altai groups, notably the Altaians, have since campaigned for her return and reburial, arguing that her excavation and display in Novosibirsk disturbed a guardian spirit tied to local misfortune, a modern chapter layered on top of an ancient one, in which the argument over what should be done with a body has outlasted, by decades now, any argument about what actually happened to her in life. Number 2. The mummies that make Egypt look young. Along the Pacific coast of what is now northern Chile and southern Peru, the Atacama Desert is one of the driest places on Earth, in stretches receiving less than a millimeter of rain a year. It is also where a fishing people called the Chinchorro began deliberately preserving their dead, roughly 7,000 years ago, a practice that predates deliberate Egyptian mummification by at least 2,000 years. The Chinchorro method, documented across sites first surveyed by the German archaeologist Max Uhl in the early 20th century and studied in far greater depth since the 1980s by the Chilean bioarchaeologist Bernardo Arriaza, involved dismantling the body entirely. Skin was removed, organs taken out, and the skeleton was reinforced internally with sticks before being reassembled to packed with reeds, ash, and clay, and resurfaced with the original skin, sometimes covered in a manganese black or, in later centuries, a red ochre paste, and finished with a clay mask over the face. What makes this entry different from every other on the list is that the Chinchorro did not save this treatment for elites. Infants, children, adults, the elderly, all received it, in numbers suggesting mummification here was closer to a universal community practice than a status marker, a detail that has reshaped how the discipline thinks about why deliberate mummification begins anywhere. Arias's research, drawing on isotope and toxicology work published through the 2010s, connects the practice's origin partly to a documented spike in infant mortality in the region driven by naturally occurring arsenic in local groundwater. Preserving the dead of a community losing children at unusual rates in his reading may be less about status and more about grief that had nowhere else to go. The technique itself changed over the roughly 4,000 years the Chinchorro practiced it. In a sequence researchers have been able to lay out almost like a technological timeline. The earliest black mummies, dated to around 5000 BCE, involved the most invasive full disassembly, the skeleton entirely stripped and rebuilt around an internal armature of sticks lashed together with plant fiber, the skin reattached like a sleeve pulled back over a frame. Later red mummies, appearing from roughly 2500 BCE onward, used a less invasive method, making incisions to remove organs while leaving the skin largely in its original position, filled and coated with ochre paste rather than fully rebuilt. The shift suggests a slow refinement of a technique passed down and adjusted across roughly 200 generations, or an extraordinary span of cultural continuity for a practice most other societies eventually abandoned or never developed at all. The Atacama's aridity does the rest of the work these bodies needed. Almost no rainfall, low humidity, and a soil chemistry hostile to the bacteria of decay mean that even Chinchorro bodies without artificial treatment, the natural mummies recovered from the same cemeteries, are frequently as intact as the deliberately prepared ones. In 2021, work by an international team led by Chilean researchers found evidence that the desert itself and the practices layered onto it are now under threat from rising coastal humidity linked to shifting climate patterns, a slow return of moisture to a place that spent 7,000 years too dry for anything, even death, to finish its job. Number 1. The girl the Ice Age let go of last. In 2007, a group of cave divers exploring a submerged chamber called Hoyo Negro, the Black Hole, deep within the flooded cenote systems of the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, descended roughly 40 meters below the surface into total darkness and found a skull resting on a ledge above a pit that dropped another 30 meters further down. Around it, scattered across the pit floor, were the bones of saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, and other Ice Age megafauna that had gone extinct in the Americas thousands of years earlier. The skeleton belongs to a girl who died between 15 and 17 years old. The formal study, led by the physical anthropologist James Chatters and published in Science in 2014, used uranium thorium dating on a thin layer of calcite that had grown directly across part of her pelvis, a mineral crust that only forms in standing water over long spans of time, to establish an age for the remains of between roughly 12,000 and 13,000 years. Among the oldest and most complete human skeletons ever found anywhere in the Americas, at the end of the last glacial period, sea levels were far lower, and the caves of the Yucatan were dry, walkable chambers. Hoyo Negro then was a pit in the cave floor, not a flooded shaft, and something, most likely a fall in near total darkness while searching for water, sent this girl and the animals around her to the bottom, where they lay undisturbed as the ice caps melted, the sea rose, and the caves slowly filled, sealing the chamber underwater for roughly 10,000 years, until divers with headlamps found what the flooding had, paradoxically, protected rather than destroyed. Recovering her required a different kind of expedition than any other entry on this list. Divers on the project, working under the direction of the underwater archaeologist Pilar Luna Eregarena and the broader Bajo Grande and Hoyo Negro survey teams, had to be trained cave divers and trained archaeologists simultaneously, operating at depths where a single wrong turn in zero visibility silt-out conditions could mean not finding the exit again. The skull and pelvis were left in place for years, while a full photogrammetric 3D model of the chamber was built before a single bone was lifted. A level of documentation caution driven partly by the site's scientific value and partly by the very real danger of the recovery itself. Chemical analysis of her bones found evidence of skeletal fluorosis, a condition caused by long-term exposure to naturally occurring fluoride in drinking water, suggesting she had spent her short life drinking from a specific fluoride-rich water source in the region, a detail that helps anchor her and the broader population she belonged to this part of the Yucatan specifically, rather than to a recent arrival from elsewhere. Her pelvic bones also show the skeletal signs of adolescent growth not yet complete, consistent with the estimated age range at death. She, now known informally as Naya, resolved an argument that had run through American archaeology for decades. Skeletons of the oldest Paleo-Americans, hers included, tend to show narrower faces and different skull proportions than most later Native American populations, a pattern some researchers had read as evidence of a separate, non-Asian ancestral population reaching the Americas first. DNA extracted from one of Naya's teeth carried a genetic marker, haplogroup D1, found only in Native American populations and their closest Siberian relatives. The skull said one story, the genome said another. What the case demonstrated is that population-level skull shape can shift within a lineage faster than genetics does, and that a single tooth, protected for 12,000 years by a cave the ocean had not yet reached, could settle an argument the bones alone could not. The ice caps that once locked away enough water to leave that chamber dry are long gone from that latitude. The chamber they left behind, filled with a sea that did not exist when Naya fell into it, is the reason she is one of the oldest, most complete, and most informative human skeletons anywhere in the hemisphere. She did not survive the Ice Age. The water the Ice Age eventually became did the surviving for her. If you want more of these, there's another one queued up on screen. Go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss it.